Hello, this is Nima Golbabai on KUCI 88.9 Irvine. This is another episode of Season 2 of Cinéshow. I'm here joined once again for a part 2 with my professor and friend, Professor and Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we're going to be doing some history and sort of a discussion about America's relationship with Israel and doing a 1800s and 1900s history of Israel. All right. Rabbi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be back here. Excited to try to cover 200 or 300 years of history in 45 minutes to an hour. We can get right to it.
All right, great. Um, so I thought we would first start with I find because I've taken a few classes. I've taken your class, the Jewish text class, but also I took Professor Burstein's class, as well as Professor Kopstein's class about Jewish history. And I always liked the 1800s period of Zionism because it's kind of it's more. I like that the odds were so against it, and it sort of seemed just like what was going to be a forgotten movement. I feel if you were alive during that time, it doesn't seem like it would have actually succeeded in the form it took. Maybe there'd be immigration to the area, but that doesn't mean it would be a fully independent state and whatnot. So maybe you could give sort of like an overview.
Of course, and both Professor Kopstein and Alon are good friends. So I'm sure whatever you learned in their classes were great. I guess the easiest way to explain it is that Zionism was the product of really three different things that happened in the Jewish world at the same time. And I think any reductionary attempt to understand Zionism historically is just going to be incomplete. And so one way of viewing Zionism, and I'll present all three and then try to argue that Zionism is a combination of all three. And one could argue, what percentage of each. The first component of Zionism is an age-old Jewish idea that stretches back to maybe even 2,500 years old, of the idea of returning to the land of Israel. It has to deal with the idea in Judaism of the diaspora and exile, of which, for people that are familiar with Jewish texts that have been produced over the last 2,000 years, one of the major themes that runs throughout all Jewish texts is the idea of exile. The idea that wherever we are now, and of course, in the last 2,000 years, Jews have lived quite literally all over the world, right? They, from Babylonia to Europe to North America to Africa to the wider Arab world. And wherever Jews were, say 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, there was this deep sense of exile and the idea that they're in the diaspora, and the idea that one day in some far off future, almost always associated with messianism, there was one day going to be a return to the land of Israel. And so that's one way to understand Zionism. It's of course an incomplete way to understand Zionism, because the question that you're asking and that a lot of historians ask is, what specifically happened in the 1800s that took this messianic belief that would have been prayed about in synagogue, let's say 3 times a day, or at the end of the Passover Seder, you say, Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. At the end of Jewish weddings, you break a glass to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem, right? How did that shift to an actual nationalistic or political endeavor? So the second thing that's important to understand is the 1800s in Europe, right? This is primarily, when we're talking early Zionism, it's primarily a conversation about Ashkenazi Jews, right? Jews that had been living in wider Europe for about 1,000 years at that time. And what's important about the 1800s in Europe, as any student of world history will know, is that this was the time of the Enlightenment, right? And so starting in the mid to late 1700s, but really growing and proliferating in the early 1800s, you have the entire Europe basically rocked by new Enlightenment ideas. And so, of course, right, as students of world history know, right, the power of the church was lessened, the power of rationality and science increased. This obviously coincided with, once the church was no longer the ruling power, right, this gave rise to ideas of democracy and liberalism and nationalism, right, to say nothing about whether or not those things are good and bad. And so all of a sudden you have, right, at this point, right, we've described two of our factors. You have this age-old Jewish belief, and then you have a lot of Jews that are starting to get involved in the Enlightenment. There's actually a word in Hebrew, the Haskalah, is a word to connote the historical period of Jewish thinkers, right? The Haskalah is loosely translated to the Jewish Enlightenment. And these were also Jews that had been living in Europe for 1,000 years. And before that, their ancestors probably lived in Babylonia. And before that, their ancestors lived in Israel, that for thousands of years were living as minorities in wider Europe, oftentimes living in places like either the shtetl, right, or the Pale of Settlement, right, if we're talking about Eastern Europe, and living conditions weren't always great. And Jews primarily, at least in the Ashkenazi medieval ages, right, this is not a time where this wasn't exactly the best historical time for Jews. There was a ton of anti-Semitism, right, throughout the centuries. And so you started having Jewish thinkers thinking, hey, wait a minute, might it be better for us, right? And this is before any conversation about Zionism even begins, but might it be better for us if we try to recreate our image? And what I mean by that is, as opposed to being these people that are ethnically and religiously and politically separate from wider Europe, perhaps it'll be better for our future in anti-Semitism if we incorporate ourselves into wider Europe. And so this had a number of immediate ramifications, right? Without, again, even pre-Zionism, right? There were a lot of Jews that became increasingly secular and tried to assimilate into Europe. On the other hand, this gave rise to denominations in Ashkenazi Judaism, right? The early reform movement, which took place in Germany in the early 1800s, was an attempt for Jews to say, what if we took Judaism and made it a little bit more Christian-like? Perhaps we'll be treated better in the wider German public. This also gave rise to Jews joining, right? This is more towards the mid to late 1800s, Jews joining the socialist or communist revolutions, and Jews saying, you know what, perhaps society will be better if we actually aren't divided based on our religion, ethnicity, all of these things. Perhaps, right, as Marx taught, perhaps the world is really just this class struggle and we should just join. And once there's a communist utopia or socialist utopia, things will be great. So Zionism, the second way to understand Zionism, is one of these outgrowths was also Jews looking around and saying, hey, wait a minute, it seems like what's in style now in Europe is for different peoples to have their own political entity, right? Different nations deserve a nation state, right? From some form of argumentation. What if we tried some version of that? Now, the last thing, right, it goes into the second thing a little bit, is that even after the Enlightenment, you could imagine a time during and after the Enlightenment where Jews in Europe thought anti-Semitism would get better, right? Anti-Semitism in the medieval ages was primarily, especially in Europe, was primarily perpetuated by the wider Christian world, right? And of course, we have all these ideas like the Jews killed Jesus, and then the Jews, right, blood libel, right? Whenever there would be the death of Christian babies, it would oftentimes be blamed on the Jews. In the 14th and 1500s, the Black Plague was blamed on the Jews, right? The Jews basically took the brunt of every ill in Europe in the Middle Ages, primarily because of the Christian world. And all of a sudden, once the Christian world loses power, you can imagine Jews thinking, okay, great, no more anti-Semitism. But of course, as the 1800s unfolded, and especially the early 1900s, it was quite clear that anti-Semitism is not going away. And so other Jews were sitting around thinking, well, hey, wait a minute. If we're not going to be safe under very strict religious rule, and we're not going to be safe under strong European nationalistic rule, and we're not going to be safe under strong European or Eastern European, say, communist rule, what other solution is there but to create our own nation state? And this is how at least early political Zionism came about, through oftentimes, right, it's associated with the name Theodor Herzl, who finally wrote his early Zionist manifesto in the mid 1890s. And this is exactly what he argues, based on, again, a synthesis of all three of these factors.
Yeah, that was a pretty complete, very good overview. I feel like the main way people look at it is through like the nationalistic lens, like through, you know, the period of nationalism during like primarily the 1800s, like moving away from divine right of kings or whatever and moving into like states based on ethnicity and whatnot. But I feel the main interesting thing about it for me, because I'm so interested in learning about the religious aspect, is um, the fact that it's so unheard of where like a people are driven from their native country like uh over 2 millennia ago, let's say 2 millennia ago, and then come back 2000 years later and somehow, especially now where it's almost impossible to form new countries and there's so many institutions that like basically prevent the changing of borders whatsoever, it's so interesting to view it from a religious point of view that, you know, like the prophetic aspect actually came to fruition. And then it is also strange that like the people that founded Israel were mostly irreligious. And that is another part that I find interesting, is that within the Jewish community, some of the most vehement opposition to Israel is from the most religious aspect. And
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is something that's oftentimes shocking to people when they understand that many in the ultra-Orthodox community are against Zionism and a modern state of Israel. The way to understand it, right, given my explanation before, just taking a step back, right, it's no secret that across religions, right, so this is true whether we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, right, other religious traditions that are currently operating in the Western world, huge generalization here, but generally the more fundamentalist you are in any religion, the more you've tried to reject enlightenment and enlightenment values, right? You're not going to have oftentimes a ultra orthodox community, or on that matter, a deeply fundamentalist evangelical, school, or a deeply Islamic fundamentalist, mosque, teaching about, enlightenment ideas and rationality and all of these things. Again, generalization, I'm sure everybody listening here can come up with a couple examples, but at least in the Jewish case, the ultra-Orthodox community was primarily a averse reaction to the Enlightenment. So exactly my explanation before, right? At this time in the early to mid 1800s, as Jews were quite literally and figuratively throwing off the garb that they had lived in the shtetl and the ghetto and becoming incorporated within wider Europe and becoming increasingly secular and all of these things, there were also a group of Jews all the way on the other end of the spectrum whose philosophy was, if this is what happens when Jews interact with the wider public, with secular ideals, with science, with culture, we need to ensure that Jews never interact with all these things. And so the ultra-Orthodox community was born, again, as a reaction to the Enlightenment. And given that Zionism could only be understood as 2/3 parts of post-Enlightenment Judaism, right? It kind of makes sense from that perspective why the ultra-Orthodox community was so skeptical, because early Zionist thinkers were not talking in religious language, right? The language that Jews had been interacting with and thinking about Israel and, right, Zion, right, in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, it's Zion, right, meaning Jerusalem, was primarily religious. It was praying to God for God to let us back into the land, right? That's always been a Jewish belief. All of a sudden, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Jews started saying, right, this is a little bit flippant, but it's as if they said, we've waited for God long enough to bring us back to Israel. God either has forgotten about us or God doesn't exist, right, as some early Zionist thinkers believed. And so we need to do this ourselves, right? So enough waiting, enough of this, idea of one day messianic hopes. Let's just do it ourselves. And so from the ultra-Orthodox perspective of them deeply believing that in Messianism, and also the flip side of Messianism in the ultra-Orthodox community was that Jews were exiled for a reason, right? If you believe that the Messiah, as Jews have believed for the last 2,000 years, we're still waiting for the Messiah, that means whenever the Messiah has not come, it means we have not been worthy. And I say we, I mean, what the Jewish community would have thought in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, right? As long as the Messiah has not come, it means we did not deserve the Messiah, which means we are doing something wrong, which means whenever we deserve it, God will bring us back to Israel. All of a sudden, now you see humans saying, forget about all that, right? That is outdated theology and philosophy. We don't need to wait for God. Let's just do it. And so the ultra-Orthodox community that, again, wanted to preserve these, age-old traditional theological beliefs saw what was going on and were immediately opposed. And so from one perspective, it seems strange because a lot of people think of Zionism as being led by sort of militantly ultra-Orthodox Jews. And when we, fast forward about 130 years to this year, to 2023, there actually is a lot more radical and ultra-Orthodox Jewish political leadership in Israel. We can get to that in a minute, but still talking about the late 1800s, as a general rule, if you were an Orthodox Jew, you were against Zionism. And this was mostly true throughout the early to mid 1900s as well.
Right. All right, we're going to take a short break and we will be back in a short amount of time, but thank you. Keep watching. All right, we are back. This is KUCI 88.9 FM. This is Nima Golbabai, host of Cinéshow. I have Professor Daniel Levine here with me. We're, doing a discussion part 2 of our chat we had about 2 months ago. And we were talking about the history of Zionism and opposition to Zionism within the ultra-Orthodox religious community. And I thought we could talk about, in the next part, sort of the more practical side, like how did it start with Herzl and maybe a little before Herzl, all the way up to, a Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, so this easily could be a 10-hour long answer, so I'll try to spare you that. But just for the listeners to know, every sentence of what I might say in the next 2 minutes could be an entire book, and could be actually many books, because there is not unanimous agreement among historians about exactly what happens, which, just to fast forward a little bit, listeners are probably familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? I know I'm sort of fast forwarding and going on a tangent a little bit. And generally, depending on which side you interact with and listen to, you're going to hear 2 completely different histories, right? I won't comment now on which one I think is right and what percentage of each I think is more correct, but just so you know, there is not a straightforward history here that everybody agrees with. So that's important to know. In the most basic level, right? Once Theodor Herzl, right, publishes his pamphlet, right? He's of course living in Europe. He gathers together some people who are going to be the future leaders of an eventual Jewish political entity. Herzl, actually, interestingly enough, wasn't actually wedded to the idea of the Jewish state being in the land of Israel. Herzl was actually willing to entertain other places, such as Uganda, for being a Jewish state, but was quickly rejected by the rest of the Zionist leadership. At that time, what we think of the land of Israel today, or Palestine, depending on our view of it, was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And so in the simplest way, and this of course can be an entire book as well, the Ottoman Empire oftentimes had absentee land ownership. And what I mean by that is there were obviously tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, we don't have great records, of Arab farmers working on the land, right? These people would eventually become the people we would discuss as and refer to as Palestinians. And these farmers oftentimes did not own their own land. The land was actually owned by, rich people with deep pockets, that were in Turkey, right, closer to the center of the Ottoman Empire. And so one of the things that early Zionists did was quite literally run these fundraising campaigns, right? And they would go to Jews in America and Jews other places and raise money and say, hey, we're trying to set up a Jewish polity in the ancient land of Israel, right? can we have some money? And of course, wealthy Jewish philanthropists would fund it. And Herzl and, the other early Zionists would go to these rich landlords in the Ottoman Empire and actually buy land. And so this is actually, I think, this is how sort of the first step of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, at this point, right, nobody would consider this a conflict in the year, let's say, 1900. But you could imagine from both sides, right, just to paint a picture of why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you really, to have a mature view of it, of both what happened and also looking towards a solution, you have to understand the perspective of both sides on a deep level, right? So just to portray that, let's imagine the situation in the 1900s, right? So early Zionists have just witnessed, right, a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, right? They realize that, at least according to their view, the only way for Jews to be safe is to go back to the historic homeland, right? They know that even if they're not very religious, Jews have been longing for this land for thousands of years. They raise money. In their mind, they do everything right. They go to the Ottoman Empire. They figure out who owns a piece of land. They buy the piece of land, and then they show up. Now, split screen, right? You now have an Arab farmer whose family has been on this land maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 generations, who one day is sitting there. All of a sudden, a car or a wagon shows up. A bunch of European guys get out, right? These Arab farmers have no clue what the ancient Jewish longing for this land. They don't know anything about what's been happening in the wider political world necessarily, right? At least early on. And all of a sudden, some random European Jewish guy shows up with a deed and says, this land that you've been working on for, the last 600 years, it's mine now. Right. And so you can imagine already, right, the two competing perspectives of what's happening here. But mostly pre-World War I, again, because after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses and Britain takes over the Middle East, right, and ends up splitting it with France and Russia, right? It's a whole mess. But at least in early Zionism, mostly there was an attempt to do one of two things: either buy land if it was owned by somebody. And also, it's true to say that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, much of what we think of the state of Israel today was swampland, right? It was a lot of land that hadn't been used for farming in hundreds of years. And so there was a lot of land that was sort of just no man's land, which was also taken by the early Zionists. And, when one thinks of the early kibbutz movement, right, these were, small socialist entities of usually young, both men and women, right? Because one of the early Zionism was radically egalitarian, and they would come and they would move into the middle of nowhere in Israel, and they would spend time, like years after years, cultivating the land, drying up the swamps, all of this, in order to start what eventually would become the Israel we know today, which is a world leader in agriculture. And so all these things were sort of happening at once. Just to fast forward the history real quick, because I don't want this to be 10 hours. After the British government takes over and British Mandate Palestine is established in the year 1917, because of a lot of Zionist lobbying power and pressure, the British government passes the British Mandate Palestine. That is a very vague document, but basically says one day there's going to be a Jewish state somewhere in this land, right? It's extremely vague. The British government did not always follow through on that promise, right? That's probably a conversation for another time. But once Britain took over, the next 30 years, there was a lot more Jewish immigration from Europe, right? Occasionally, Britain would halt immigration, right, once you get to the 1930s, but the 1920s was a time of increased immigration and building up and the proliferation of the kibbutz movement. And really, one of the interesting things about Zionism in the state of Israel is all of these nationalistic and governmental entities were actually set up before the state was founded. So generally, you'd imagine, right, if you want to create a country from scratch, generally you would think, okay, let's set a country, then let's create a government. And then once we create a government, then we'll have this trickle down effect of, okay, let's figure out, a banking situation and an economic situation. Okay, now let's figure out, an army. Now let's figure out, right? Zionism was the other way around. All of these governmental agencies were set up 30, 40, 50 years before the actual state was founded. And so by the time declaration of Israel happened in 1948, and again, I'm skipping over major swaths of history here, so listeners that are interested should definitely take either Professor Burstein or Professor Kopstein's great classes on Israel here, or they're always welcome to grab coffee with me. But generally speaking, by the time 1948 happened, the Zionist movement was already pretty well set up to be able to establish a state quite literally overnight.
Right. That is a very interesting part that I was surprised by when I first learned about this stuff, because I had no idea about sort of complexities of it all. But it is so strange how they had such first of all, like the bravery to get up from Europe and go to this place that's essentially not anything anyone would ever choose to move to from Europe at the time. And then to create all these institutions that are sort of that didn't have borders at the time, but then able to be quickly transplanted into a country and have them run successfully, and having to defend against military threats at the same time, and social threats and demographic change of a region, and have it go well. But I think the central thing that allowed it to actually work, and I don't think this sort of thing could ever work without a core uniting principle. And I have a quote that I really like, and maybe you've heard it before. I actually recently, about a month ago, texted it to my best friend who's Jewish and is a really great guy. And I didn't mean it in a political sense, but I think it applies here. And it's like, to be Jewish means to have a memory. And I think that is very beautiful in a non-political sense, but there's no way, I don't think, people can establish a country that hasn't existed or in 2000 plus years, and certainly not in the form it happened, without some deep historical claim, first of all, and common memory of a people, of their fathers and their grandfathers telling stories about this land. And some of that is biblical and some of it is historical. And I don't know, I find it very beautiful and interesting. And I really did it is a good explanation from the Arab point of view. People come from Europe, and obviously Muslims know about Jews, but the ones they probably knew about lived in their home countries. So you have a different type of Jew coming from Europe, and they have a deed to a land, and they don't know that they had any reason to buy this land. And then it sort of turns into something that's beyond the capacity of the people that were living there. And also the whole thing about a collapse of an empire, meaning a dispute about land ownership. That's so classic. That happens all the time. And with the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the state-owned companies, they had to quickly divvy it out. So this is sort of the same thing, but with 2000 years of pent-up energy.
Yeah, no, there's a common, right? You hear a lot that people say that Zionism is colonialism. And the interesting thing is that, right, Zionism is not just colonialism, right? And I think it's a very nuanced point that probably upsets people that are on all sides of this equation. Zionism used the tactics of 1800s and 1900s colonialism to achieve a goal that was not colonialistic in nature, right? And there isn't really a good parallel to think about this, because as you said, the memory of connection and longing for land was so deep in the Jewish mind and Jewish culture that the early Zionists that risked everything to show up and to build, quite literally a country from scratch, they weren't doing it on behalf of course, any other empire, right? the 1900s saw so much colonialism, right, throughout the Middle East and Africa and everything there. And almost always the recipe was people that were sent to then go back and enrich a mother country, or in some way, extend borders of a mother country and things like that. Right? Zionism, there was no extension of any empire or any country, of course, but the tactics looked almost the exact same. And so again, from some perspective, it makes sense why, right? If anything, it would be hard to differentiate between what was going on in the land of Israel in the year 1900 and what was going on anywhere else in Africa or the Middle East in the 1900s, right? Is Zionism colonialism? No, but it would have been very hard to tell the difference. And so, right, it's interesting because there's such radical different views of Zionism today. One of the reasons why I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been going on for, depending on who's count, and when you start counting, let's just say 120 years, the reason why this conflict has been perpetuated is because both sides are starting with such opposite premises that they just can't, right? You can't agree on anything, right? They don't even agree with the background basis reality, right? And I'm going to, I'm going to present this very black and white. Of course, there are positions in the middle, but in general, the dominant Jewish/Zionist position is one of returning, right? We have longed for this land for thousands of years. This is a land that has been conquered by, empires in the ancient world. This is land that was then conquered by the Christian world, then conquered back by the Islamic world, then conquered back by the Christian world in the Crusades, then conquered back by the Islamic world. And so this is a land that has seen a lot of conquering, right? All of a sudden, we've returned to our ancient homeland. Did it require some, a couple of wars? Yeah, everything requires war, right? Again, this is according to the late 1800s Zionist philosophy of, just the history of this land has seen war and battle. We actually, right, I'm still rationalizing the Zionist position for a minute. We actually tried to do this with as much of a olive branch as possible. And, you can read early Zionist thinkers. And again, they were a little bit naive in terms of what they wanted to accomplish. But the vast majority of them did not come out with guns blazing, as what happened with almost every European colonialist project in the 1800s or 1900s, right? So the dominant Zionist view is Zionism is a return to an ancient homeland, right? The dominant Palestinian view is Zionism is not a return. Zionism is an act of violence and colonialism and, right, people moving, right? Just another example of people from Europe moving to Africa or the Middle East, plundering it, right? Hurting the inhabitants and, everything that goes along with that. And these are just complete opposite premises. And so, right, it's no wonder why when it comes to virtually every other issue, right, whether we're talking about borders or Jerusalem or status of refugees on both sides, right? And again, for listeners more familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they'll know these examples. For listeners that have never heard of these questions, right, again, this is a long and storied topic, so they're not going to get everything they need to know from this podcast. But the problem is that I think personally that both sides have to deeply try to understand the starting premises of the other side. And they don't have to necessarily agree that it's true in terms of their starting premises, but just to understand why, let's say, right, there's still this idea in some of the Palestinian leadership, right, and this is certainly true with more militant groups such as Hamas, right, which is operating in Gaza, that one day if they just make things bad enough, Jews will go back to Europe, right? This is something that you see a lot with Hamas leadership, right? And this is, right, not only is it false, it's almost comical, right? Because Hamas is thinking of Jews as these European implants that are coming in to plunder a land, whereas nobody that's living in Israel in the year 2023 has any connection, right? And I say nobody, right? I'm sure there's that, there's the 10 people that do, but nobody's thinking, oh, maybe we'll one day go back to Europe, right? Right? They've come home. On the other hand, from the Israeli point of view and the Zionist point of view, there oftentimes is not a deep enough understanding of the fact that, hey, there was another people here when we showed up, and those people are still there. And if we want to actually live up to the ethos of Judaism and Jewish values, and even Zionism and early Zionist values, we need to ensure that we have a country that extends equal rights to everybody, a country that treats people fairly, right? Just to take the Jewish take for a moment, the idea that is the most often repeated in the Torah is the idea of you shall treat the stranger or the foreigner well because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt, right? This idea shows up dozens of times throughout the Hebrew Bible, right? I can imagine, right, as the Israelites are wandering through the desert, they're getting tired of Moses saying that because they're like, oh, there he goes again about, treating the stranger well. And you can imagine, right, these people traveling through the desert thinking like, what strangers are there, right? We're wandering through the desert. But I think, again, the real test of ethics and morality comes when you have power, right? If you have no power, if I have no power or influence or money and I'm just, wandering the desert alone, right? There are very few moral tests that are coming my way. Morality starts specifically when you have power, and especially power over people that are different than you. And I think, again, the major test for Israel, and, these days I would not give Israel too high of a grade, but the major test for Israel, both in the 1900s and also now that we're going into the mid 21st century, is going to be, can we live up to these ethical and moral ideals of treating the stranger well? And that, of course, extends to, right, we can talk specific policies, but just in a very general sense.
Yeah, very good. It's very morally relevant and a great, political summary. Before we get on to our last topic, maybe we do like a 5-minute sort of explanation of like the last period before the Declaration of Independence, or like maybe a few years before the Declaration of Independence. Everybody knows the Holocaust. So maybe we do like after the Holocaust to the Declaration of Independence.
Sure. So I just want to eradicate one misconception, not that you necessarily have, but a lot of people have, that a lot of people think that Zionism was an answer to the Holocaust. Hopefully by now, this history, it's clear that Zionism as an idea started long before the Holocaust, right? Depending on when you start the Holocaust, right? The Nuremberg laws say were 1933, right? The actual Holocaust didn't start till several years later. What the Holocaust did change was, I think, two important things. One, I think it definitely changed the world opinion. And so one of the famous 1947 UN vote, right? Really the reason why Israel ended up becoming a state just in terms of international politics is because at a certain point, and again, I'm shortening the history here, but after 30 years of being the rulers of this land, the British Empire in the mid 1940s said that we have enough, right? The British Empire was dealing with two different populations, right? The Jews and the Arabs that were not happy that the British were still there. And so the British Empire at a certain point realized that it's not worth it. And so they punted to the UN, and the UN, and really one of the first acts that the UN did was vote in favor of establishing a state, right? If it wasn't for the Holocaust, that might not have happened, right? In terms of the world favor turning towards a Jewish political entity. The second thing that it did in terms of the Jewish world is it virtually convinced every, I'm going to say every, right? I'll say 99% of Jews in the world after the Holocaust deeply understood the need for a state of Israel, right? So if you were alive in the late 1800s or early 1900s, even the like 1920s and 1930s, there was not unanimous agreement in the Jewish world that Zionism is a good idea. There were a lot of anti-Zionist Jewish thinkers in the 1920s that were arguing this is not a good idea, right? Jews should stay in their countries, either in Europe or other countries, and try to make that country a better place, right? We should not have to, right? The answer to anti-Semitism is not building up a country in the Middle East, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Once the Holocaust happened, virtually the entire Jewish world became, if not outwardly proud Zionists, almost practical Zionists, including, by the way, the ultra-Orthodox community that I was talking about before. The ultra-Orthodox community was obviously hurt extremely badly by the Holocaust, right? That's not strong enough language, right? It was decimated by the Holocaust. And most of the ultra-Orthodox world, right? Again, some moved to America, but a lot also moved to, at that time, British Mandate Palestine. And so today there's a huge ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, right? That they are the descendants of, again, ultra-Orthodox Jews who, not because they philosophically agreed with setting up a state and Zionism, but just practically that was the only choice that they had. And so the Holocaust had those effects. Really, there was not that much time, to be honest, between the end of the Holocaust or end of World War II and the establishing of the state. I would say, just some of the most interesting stories between the mid 1940s and 1948 is there was a lot of, let's say, illegal Jewish immigration into British Mandate Palestine. At that point, Britain had basically closed the door to most immigration. And actually, one of the most harmful things that the British government did is, at the time that the Holocaust was at its worst, the British government did not allow Jews from Europe to actually enter into British Mandate Palestine, which created, of course, a lot of resentment and a whole mess. But generally, in the mid 1940s, it was just a lot of the Jewish world processing post-Holocaust. And at that point, right now that you had a lot of the political energy, both in the Jewish world, but also the international world, realizing that, right, they messed up, right? They didn't intercede quick enough, right? This is certainly true about America also, which easily, right, and, there's a lot of, this is going off on a little bit of tangent, but, historians always ask, why did the U.S. not just bomb the train tracks going to Auschwitz, right? Again, it seems a little overly simple, but the U.S. didn't actually enter into World War II until they were attacked, right? Historians, anybody who has studied the history understands that. And so, to some extent, the world just felt bad and ashamed. And so there was a lot of political and social energy going towards the eventual founding of a state.
Yeah, that's definitely a great way to explain it. So last section, and you ended on America, which is great. I don't know if you planned that, but it was pretty smart. Let's talk about, I think we can talk about probably America's maybe reaction to the Holocaust, and also maybe America's founders and Judaism, because I've heard a few stories that are kind of interesting. And I also learned a few things in Professor Kopstein's class about like what the Nazis thought about America, and they did think about it in like a Jewish connotation, is what I understand. So maybe we start with America and the Holocaust.
Sure. So one of the differences between America, I'll start a little bit, way further back. And scholars debate about the extent of how true this is. But America has been uniquely exceptional for Jews. It doesn't mean it's been perfect. It doesn't mean America's perfect, right? All those caveats aside. But America in its founding started on the premise that Jews are going to have equal rights. That was not true in any other country throughout Jewish history, right? And what I mean by that is whether or not Jews were living in Europe under Christian rule, or Spain under medieval Islamic rule, or the Middle East and North Africa under medieval Islamic rule, Jews never had equal rights, right? Obviously, there were some times, right? Spain happened to be better than, living in England in the 1100s. But in general, there was never a country founded on the premise of equal rights for everybody. The U.S. was. Now, of course, the U.S. didn't always act on that, right? And they had a very limited definition of who gets equal rights, obviously, in 1776. But Jews have always felt a little bit more at home in America than they have in any other country that isn't Israel. And that also is true today. I don't think, right, personally, right, as somebody who's lived his entire life, I actually did live in Israel for a few years, but I've lived most of my life in America. I feel at home in America. I don't have that age-old Jewish feeling that I am in exile or the diaspora or all of those things that I almost certainly would have felt, by the way, if I was alive in any other country at any point in history, right? So America has been uniquely exceptional for Jews, with all the caveats of all the things that America has done that is not perfect. Again, there's depending on which historical, analysis you take, right? The US does have a major failing of not interceding into the Holocaust quick enough. I mean, again, all sorts of the different reasons that, one could immediately think about come to play, right? There probably was not a lot of political and social will for the US to intercede into another major world war, right? That's probably a lot of it, right? A lot of people might point fingers at the American Jewish community, probably did not ruffle enough feathers, at least early on in the 1930s, to get the US to intercede, right? But this is also an American Jewish community. There was an uptick in anti-Semitism in America in the early 20th century. And so you can imagine, right? We have hindsight. We now understand how bad the Holocaust was. But you can imagine American Jewish leaders thinking in the mid 1930s, okay, this Hitler guy is very bad, right? He's even evil, right? I'm talking about pre-concentration camps, pre-Holocaust. But let's not ruffle too many feathers in America, because anti-Semitism is also getting pretty bad here, and we don't want to come across as, trying to petition, the American public to do something for Jews overseas. Let's not ruffle any feathers. Let's just keep our head down. And so again, there's a lot of turmoil and controversy with that history, but generally speaking, right, it is pretty pitiful of what the U.S. did and did not do in the early days of the Holocaust, and even towards the end of the Holocaust.
Right. Because it's understandable you don't want to get into a massive war, but I feel to help with refugees that are clearly have a legitimate threat to their lives is, I think, something that could have been easily done. I just feel, I don't know, perhaps it was just the times with the Depression and whatnot. America was a very apprehensive land. And I think I want to talk a little bit about the founders. I did a bit of research about, because we talked about how America is, uniquely accepting to Jews and people of other religions. And it was sort of equal rights, or not equal rights, but the presumption of equal rights mostly, without a caveat, because I know in other countries, especially Islamic ones, Jews only they had to be very religious. In Yemen, I know they were treated pretty good as long as they followed all the laws of the Torah and whatnot. Europe, they obviously were treated very terribly. But I did a bit of reading, and I apparently Washington and Benjamin Franklin had a uniquely positive view of the Jewish religion. And apparently Franklin funded a synagogue. Washington spoke positively. Jefferson apparently did not have a positive view, which I found surprising, because he doesn't seem to be that Christian.
He's so nice in Hamilton. I don't know.
Yeah, and then Hamilton, people actually think he may have been Jewish, because he went to what did he go to, Hebrew school or synagogue or something?
No. He was from, without going on a whole different tangent, a lot of Jews that were, a lot of people that were in Central and South America, right, could have a lot of Jewish lineage, because there was a lot of forced conversions that happened in the 1400s that were happening there. I don't know as much about, Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson in terms of their disposition towards Jews. I do know that Washington famously wrote a letter to one of the first synagogues that was in America, the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, that still has sort of original letter that is from George Washington, who basically says, welcome, you're at peace to practice your religion here. And so yeah, listen, you mentioned, the medieval ages and in other places, and even today. Listen, there are Jews today living in, not a lot, but probably the biggest Jewish community that is under Islamic rule is in Iran. And a lot of people are actually surprised to hear that. For, the last 40 or 50 years since the revolution, Jews in Iran, it's not that they're being tortured. You can have a good life as a Jew in Iran. A lot of people are shocked to hear that. but you are not equal, right? You're under, right? You are basically a second class citizen. Now, of course, at some points in history, being a second class citizen meant something very different than at other times, right? Not all second class citizenry in Jewish history is equal. But again, what we think of liberal democratic values, where you, regardless of what ethnicity, religion, gender, right, you deserve the same and equal protections under the law as me, right? Something that I would hope everybody listening to this podcast agrees with. That was not the status quo and norm in Jewish history. When it came to America, that generally was. Again, it doesn't mean that there was no anti-Semitism in America, but it means at least the premises that America was operating with when it came to Jews, of course, when it came to other peoples, right, especially the African American community, right, very different story. But when it came to Jews, it was markedly different.
Right. God, I thought of a terrible joke because I'm not saying to you, but like the crypto Jews, like the Jews that like pretended to convert to save themselves but continued to practice. I just made a terrible joke in my head about Sam Bankman-Fried.
Funny.
Yeah, I'm
I
not gonna
like it.
say it. All right. But we got 4 minutes left. We're recording this on Zoom because I'm not able to be in the studio today, and I have a free version, so we only got 4 minutes here on the clock. So I think we're gonna do a little bit of an outro, and I'm gonna plug Rabbi Daniel's class, which I think is full. So, but people will drop, I think, he says. So you can look into it, but it's the Jewish text class, and I'll let Rabbi Daniel explain it a little bit, and then I will sign off.
Sure. So if anybody is looking to take a Jewish studies class this year, I'm going to leave I'll just give my phone number. Text me. It's 858-952-9632. And I can tell you all about Jewish classes happening at UCI, both in the fall and winter and spring. I might actually be teaching another class in the spring about Jewish philosophy, but more information soon. But anybody here that's been interested in anything we talked about and wants to find time to grab coffee or wants to come to a Jewish community event on campus, feel free to reach out whenever.
Yeah, and I loved his class. It was my favorite class I took at UCI, and maybe of all time. Yeah, probably of all time, let's say. And I really like having Professor Levine on because I can pretend I'm still in his class and learn a lot of stuff. So,
Thank you, Nima. Thank
um,
you for having me on here.
yeah, and we should do it again sometime soon, but maybe we'll do a movie next time.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. So that's been Nima Golbabai and Professor Daniel Levine of UCI. This is Cinéshow on KUCI 88.9 Irvine, and I'm with you to the end of the line. All right, there you go. So that was pretty good.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, very nice.
Thank you for setting this up. What time is it where you are?
6:54.
Okay, not too late.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, this was fun. I'm glad
Yeah,
we did
it's very
this.
fun.
Uh, and yeah, if I do teach this other class, by the way, in the spring, you should definitely take it.
Yes, I will.
I need
Definitely.
to make yeah, I'm still waiting for 100% confirmation on it, but
Oh
if
yeah.
it happens, I will let you
That'll
know.
be good. That'll be really good. Yeah, I love learning more. And I'll continue watching your YouTube videos.
Perfect. Yeah, and feel free. I mean, I know you're not here this quarter, but definitely come to Hillel stuff once you're back.
Yeah, of course. All right, thank you
Amazing.
so much.
You too. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.